The Guermantes Way, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, by Marcel Proust, Volume 3 of In Search of Lost Time. So I've just been killing it reading In Search of Lost Time because when I started these books, I didn't really know exactly how I was going to go about tackling them. If I was just going to, put my head down and try to plow through them one after the other, or if I was going to space them out. And it's a commitment when you undertake to read 4,000 odd pages of material. But I read the first two volumes and ended up unexpectedly actually enjoying those more than I thought I would. And so I thought, why don't we just roll into volume three and keep the streak going? So that's what I did. Rolled right into the Guermantes Way. And now, having read this book, I think I understand why some people don't like Proust. Because this book, to call it tedious might be something of an understatement. This book was downright painful at times. It is not the most thrilling thing to read. In fact, it is um, quite dull, actually, at times. But I will try my best to explain my feelings about the book. So, The Guermantes Way, picking up sometime after Within a Budding Grove, the narrator is now a young man. And his family have just moved from their former residence into a new abode, which actually adjoins that of the Guermantes. Now, the Guermantes were characters who were introduced in Volume 1 as kind of background figures, but they're very much at the forefront in this book. And they are nobility, I think. They're kind of at the top of the societal food chain of France. They're a duke and duchess. And the narrator, being as he is now a young adult, is setting about trying to ascend the societal ladder and to get himself admitted into the most prestigious salons of France. And he does this by really, really fixating on the Guermantes, in particular Madame Guermantes. And he downright obsesses over her to the point where he literally just kind of stalks her through the streets because Madame Guermantes is the embodiment kind of everything that he lusts for out of life. She is, fabulously wealthy and aristocratic, and also she kind of is very cultured and refined, and she has like the best salon, the best meeting place where all the minds of Paris meet, and. So that's basically just the entirety of this book is the narrator trying to get himself into her salon and into her good graces. So the narrator goes to see his friend early on, Robert de Saint Loup, who was introduced in the last volume, and who is, I think, the nephew of Madame de Guermantes. So he goes to see him to try to ply him into saying a word to his aunt, I think. And so then he spends some time with Robert de Saint Loup and his friends, and they discuss like military strategy, which that was actually kind of fascinating. And also there they discuss the Dreyfus affair, and there is a lot of discussion of the Dreyfus affair in this book. And if you don't know what that is or was, the Dreyfus affair was a very notable event in France around that time. It involved a Jewish man named Dreyfus who was accused and convicted, I think, of selling state secrets to foreigners. But it turns out he was actually set up and framed, and so it was a big hullabaloo, and it really caused a rift in France at that time. And also, it served to really expose just how deeply anti Semitic French society was under the surface. So there's a whole hell of a lot of discussion about that in this book. And then also, the narrator's grandmother, her health is failing. She has a stroke, and then she eventually dies. And that's really kind of the emotional heart of this book. Or at least that's where, for me, most, if not all, of the emotion in this book came from, was the narrator dealing with the death of his grandmother, or her impending death. Um, And then the narrator eventually does get admitted to Madame de Guermantes' salon, and then we get, I shit you not, hundreds of pages of the most tedious chit chat imaginable. And then Baron de Charlus, who was the uncle, I think, of Robert de Saint Loup, and who we briefly met in the previous volume, offers to take the narrator under his wing and kind of be a mentor to him in society. But then the narrator kind of misses his appointment or something, and then Charlot gets pissed, and then they kind of have a little tiff. And then at the end, the narrator is invited to yet another interminable dinner party where Swan, the guy who the first volume is named after, shows up. And he's like dying now, and also he is a committed drug, which is what the people were called who supported Dreyfus in the case. And then he's like, "I'm dying, bitches," and then the book just ends. So that's basically the book. When I say that this book is uneventful, I mean it is. It is very, very slow in its going. And the reason I didn't enjoy this one as much as the previous two, even though I thought I was going to, like this one's even longer than the previous two were. But for about the first like 300 pages or so of it, I was actually really enjoying it. I thought it was going to be, a repeat experience that I had with the first two books where I, actually kind of enjoyed it. But after those first 300 pages, give or take, when the narrator makes it into Madame de Guermantes' salon, um, the pace slows to a crawl. I'm not kidding. It's hundreds of pages of chit chat, dinner parties, tea parties, basically, just people talking about the most inane crap imaginable. And it is not fun to read. It's not. Like the pacing in the first 300 or so pages was um, more palatable and also the narrator is more active in those first 300 pages because he's actually trying to do something. But then once he does that something, he is wholly passive for the remainder of the book. In fact, there are long swaths in this book where the narrator barely even speaks. He's just kind of absorbing all this tedious crap, and it's not engaging anymore because the narrator isn't really doing anything. So this book was not nearly as enjoyable, although we do get to see some evolution, or perhaps you might say devolution, um, of the narrator. Because in this book, the narrator becomes kind of a twat, really. He does. Like, he's kind of insufferable in this one because he is so dead set on trying to get into the good graces of Madame de Guermantes that he will basically just stop at nothing. And he kind of just uses his friends, like he uses Robert de Saint Loup. He's he goes to see him and then he's talking to him and it's basically in essence just like, yeah, enough about you. Now can you get me into your aunt's salon? It's he's kind of a user in this, and he's definitely a climber in this book. And so by the end of this book, he's kind of just really a twat. He really is. He's kind of insufferable a little bit in his single-mindedness in regards to something that really is so shallow at its core. And so I didn't really come away liking the narrator quite as much as I did in the previous two books because he's not quite as savory as he was. Although I will give it credit that there is at least some kind of development there, even if it may not be what the reader would like to see. But anyway, to get down to the techniques of it, the writing is just as fabulous as it was in the past two books. No complaints. I mean, as I've just said, there is some character development, although maybe not in the direction you'd want. But the pacing is just glacial. It is truly glacial. It's not engaging. It really isn't. This was the brick wall. Like the first two volumes of In Search of Lost Time, I was like, hell yeah, these books aren't bad at all. How can anyone not like these books? And then you read this one and you're like, oh, that's how. So that's why people don't like Proust. However, that being said, I would still like to read some of my favorite passages from this, in keeping, I suppose, with my previous reviews of the preceding volumes, because the meat of these books, what keeps you going even when it's just unbearable seemingly, is the scattered musings which the narrator has on a variety of subjects, some of which I will read now because, again, it's Proust. This writing just demands to be read aloud. So here we have the narrator. Um, the narrator is reflecting in this scene how his maid, Francois, who he really thought was like, really thought highly of him, actually might not. And so he is confronted with the unpleasant truth that someone that he always thought highly of him might hold him in a much lower esteem than he had presumed. So we get this kind of reflection here, which I thought was kind of insightful and valuable as well. And thus it was she who first gave me the idea that a person does not, as I had imagined, stand motionless and clear before our eyes, with his merits, his defects, his plans, his intentions with regard to ourselves, like a garden at which we gaze through a railing, with all its borders spread out before us. But as a shadow which we can never penetrate, of which there can be no such thing as direct knowledge, with respect to which we form countless beliefs, based upon words and sometimes actions, neither of which can give us anything but inadequate and, as it proves, contradictory information. A shadow behind which we can alternately imagine, with equal justification, that there burns the flame of hatred and of love. So, one of the big themes I think I'm seeing in these books is that of perception, the way that we perceive things, and the way that those perceptions may not actually be reflective of things as they actually stand. Um, I like that little passage as the narrator kind of gets a wake up call that what he took to be the truth for so long actually might not be. But then over here, uh, flipping ahead a little bit, um, this is an interesting reflection on the nature of sleep on the part of the narrator, and it's really quite profound how he views it as such a kind of a miraculous thing. How after sleeping and upon awakening, um, we remember who we are still, and what a kind of incredible thing human consciousness is, because so much of us, I don't know that I'd say all of us, but so much of who we are is an accretion of memories. And the narrator is reflecting how it's really it's really quite amazing that after we have an interruption in our lives, such as sleep, we are able to recall all that and still be the person that we were. So this is a nice little excerpt here, I thought. Sometimes I had heard nothing, being in one of those slumbers into which we fall as into a pit from which we are heartily glad to be drawn up a little later, heavy, overfed, digesting all that has been brought to us, as by the nymphs who fed the infant Hercules, by those agile vegetative powers whose activity is doubled while we sleep. We call that a leaden sleep, and it seems as though, even for a few moments after such a sleep is ended, one has oneself become a simple figure of lead. One is no longer a person. How then, searching for one's thoughts, one's personality, as one searches for a lost object, does one recover one's own self rather than any other? Why, when one begins again to think, is it not a personality other than his previous one that becomes incarnate in one? One fails to see what dictates the choice, or why, among the millions of human beings one might be, it is on the being one was the day before that unerringly one lays one's hand. What is it that guides us when there has been a real interruption, whether it be that our unconsciousness has been complete or our dreams entirely different from ourselves? There has been there has indeed been death, as when the heart has ceased to beat and a rhythmical traction of the tongue revives us. No doubt the room, even if we have seen it only once before, awakens memories to which other older memories cling, or perhaps some were dormant in us of which we now become conscious. The resurrection at our awakening after that beneficent attack of mental alienation, which is sleep, must, after all, be similar to what occurs when we recall a name, a line, a refrain that we had forgotten. And perhaps the resurrection of the soul after death is to be conceived as a phenomenon of memory. So, love that passage. This book, even though I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the previous two, it does have some really great lines in it. And I really like that passage because, again, it's getting at the real heart of In Search of Lost Time, which is memory. And the narrator is reflecting there, about how we're able to recall who we were the day before. And I love that parting line, how the resurrection of the soul may perhaps be an act of memory. I like it. So then flipping over a little bit more, we come to, bear with me, because there are several passages in this book that I wanted to read. I may have to consult my phone where I wrote them down, but I think I found the next one. Bear with me. Oh yeah, this here, the narrator is seeing his grandmother by herself without him in the room. She's not aware that he's watching her, and he's remarking how different a person is when we're not, when they don't know that we're around, and that's the true person, and that so much of what we conceive of as that person is really just our own conceptions. It's kind of an act of projection, if you will. And so the narrator is here getting a glimpse for the first time of his grandmother as she truly is. And I thought it was quite profound. So I was wretched at having failed to say goodbye to San Lu, but I went nevertheless, for my only concern was to return to my grandmother. Always until then, in this little country town, when I thought of what my grandmother must be doing by herself, I had pictured her as she was when with me, but eliminating myself without taking into account the effects on her of such an elimination. Now I had to free myself at the first possible moment and in her arms from the phantom, hitherto unsuspected and suddenly called into being by her voice, of a grandmother really separated from me, resigned, having something I had never yet thought of her as having, a definite H, who had just received a letter from me in the empty house in which I had already imagined Mamma when I had left her to go to Baalbek. Alas, it was this phantom that I saw when, entering the drawing room before my grandmother had been told of my return, I found her there reading. I was in the room, or rather I was not yet in the room, since she was not aware of my presence, and like a woman whom one surprises at a piece of needlework which she will hurriedly put aside if anyone comes in, she was absorbed in thoughts which she had never allowed to be seen by me. Of myself, thanks to that privilege which does not last, but which gives one, during the brief moment of return, the faculty of being suddenly the spectator of one's own absence. There was present only the witness, the observer in traveling coat and hat, the stranger who does not belong to the house, the photographer who is called to take a photograph of places which one will never see again. The process that automatically occurred in my eyes when I caught sight of my grandmother was indeed a photograph. We never see the people who are dear to us save in the animated system, the perpetual motion of our incessant love for them, which, before allowing the images that their faces present to reach us, seizes them in its vortex and flings them back upon the idea that we have always had of them, makes them adhere to it, coincide with it. However, since into the forehead and the cheeks of my grandmother I had been accustomed to read all the most delicate, the most permanent qualities of her mind, how, since every habitual glance is an act of necromancy, each face that we love a mirror of the past, how could I have failed to overlook what had become dulled and changed in her, seeing that in the most trivial spectacles of our daily life, our eyes, charged with thought, neglect, as would of classical tragedy, every image that does not contribute to the action of the play, and retain only those that may help to make its purpose intelligible. But if, instead of our eyes, it should happen to be a purely physical object, a photographic plate that has watched the action, then what we see in the courtyard of the Institute, for example, instead of the dignified emergence of an academician who is trying to hail a cab, will be his tottering steps, his precautions to avoid falling on his back, the parabola of his fall, as though he were drunk or the ground covered in ice. So it is when some cruel trick of chance prevents our intelligent and pious tenderness from coming forward in time to hide from our eyes what they ought never to behold. When it is forestalled by our eyes, and they, arriving first in the field and having it to themselves, set to work mechanically, like films, and show us in place of the beloved person who has long ago ceased to exist, but whose death our tenderness has always hitherto kept concealed from us, the new person whom 100 times daily it has clothed with a loving and mendacious likeness, and like a sick man who, not having looked at his own reflection for a long time, and regularly composing the features which he never sees in accordance with the ideal image of himself that he carries in his mind, recoils on catching sight in the glass, in the middle of an arid desert, of a face, of the sloping pink protuberance of a nose as huge as one of the pyramids of Egypt. I, for whom my grandmother was still myself, I who had never seen her save in my own soul, always in the same place in the past, through the transparency of contiguous and overlapping memories, suddenly in our drawing room, which formed part of a new world, that of time, that which is inhabited by the strangers of whom we say, "He's begun to age a good deal." For the first time, and for a moment only, since she vanished very quickly, I saw, sitting on the sofa beneath the lamp, red faced, heavy, and vulgar, sick, daydreaming, letting her slightly crazed eyes wander over a book, an overburdened old woman whom I did not know. So that's really poignant. I think the narrator is seeing his grandmother for the first time as she really is, without his preconceived notions of her that he's kind of projected on her all his life. It's kind of a rude awakening. It can be when we see the people that we think we know and realize that much of what we thought we knew was really just kind of ourselves thrust upon them. Good stuff. Now, like I said, I'll have to consult my cellular phone here for the next page. So bear with me. Um, Flipping over just a little bit more, we have this passage here. Um, this also, like the previous passage, one of the previous passages I read, it's also the narrator once more reflecting on sleep and what sleep kind of does to our minds and our consciousnesses and such. So hang on. Oh yeah. There is no need, when one is trying to find sleep, to give much thought to the quest, but habit is very useful, and even the absence of thought. But in these afternoon hours I lacked both. Before going to sleep, I devoted so much time to thinking that I should be unable to do so, that even after I was asleep, a little of my thought remained. It was no more than a glimmer in the almost total darkness, but it was enough to cast a reflection in my sleep. First, of the idea that I could not sleep, and then a reflection of this reflection that it was in my sleep that I had had the idea that I was not asleep. Then, by further refraction, my awakening to a fresh doze in which I was trying to tell some friends who had come into my room that a moment earlier, when I was asleep, I had imagined that I was not asleep. These shadows were barely distinguishable. It would have required a keen and quite useless delicacy of perception to seize them. Similarly, in later years in Venice, long after the sun had set, when it seemed to be quite dark, I have seen, thanks to the echo, itself imperceptible, of a last note of light held indefinitely on the surface of the canals, as though by the effect of some optical pedal, the reflections of the palaces displayed as though for all time in a darker velvet on the crepuscular grayness of the water. One of my dreams was the synthesis of what my imagination had often sought to depict in my waking hours of a certain sea-girt place in its medieval past. In my sleep, I saw a Gothic city rising from a sea whose waves were stilled as in a stained glass window. An arm of the sea divided the town in two. The green water stretched to my feet. On the opposite shore, it washed round the base of an Oriental church, and beyond it, houses which existed already in the 14th century, so that to go across to them would have been to ascend the stream of time. This dream in which nature had learned from art, in which the sea had turned Gothic, this dream in which I longed to attain, in which I believed that I was attaining to the impossible, was one that I felt I had often dreamed before. But as it is the nature of what we imagine in sleep to multiply itself in the past, and to appear, even when new, to be familiar, I suppose that I was mistaken. I noticed, however, that I did indeed frequently have this dream. I really like that, especially that line about ascending the stream of time, because that's really what these books are doing. It's the narrator going back in time in his own mind to recall that which is otherwise lost to him. So really good stuff there, I thought. And then we have this passage here, which is the narrator also reflecting um, about art. And this is also good because these books are, well, first of all, these books are works of art, but they're kind of self-reflective works of art in that the narrator kind of, it's kind of, it's like kind of meta a little bit as the narrator is creating art, but at the same time he is reflecting on what that act of creation actually entails and what it means. So here we have some interesting insights into what the narrator thinks of artists and such. So, people of taste tell us nowadays that Renoir is a great 18th century painter, but in so saying, they forget the element of time, and that it took a great deal of time, even at the height of the 19th century, for Renoir to be hailed as a great artist. To succeed thus in gaining recognition, the original painter or the original writer proceeds on the lines of the oculist. The course of treatment they give us by their painting or by their prose is not always pleasant. When it is at an end, the practitioner says to us, "Now look," and lo and behold, the world around us, which was not created once and for all, but is created afresh as often as an original artist is born, appears to us entirely different from the old world, but perfectly clear. Women pass in the street different from those we formerly saw because they are Renoirs. Those Renoirs we persistently refuse to see as women. The carriages, too, are Renoirs, and the water and the sky. We feel tempted to go for a walk in the forest, which is identical with the one which, when we first saw, it looked like anything in the world except a forest, like, for instance, a tapestry of innumerable hues, but lacking precisely the hues peculiar to forests. Such is the new imperishable universe which has just been created. It will last until the next geological catastrophe is precipitated by a new painter or writer of original talent. And that again, that just really gets at, I think, the heart of these books because he's saying there that great artists, great writers, painters, whatever, kind of divide the world into the now and the then. The world that we saw before, we saw it through the lens of their work, and the world that we see now, that we do see it through the lens of their work. And I think what Proust is doing with these books is kind of giving us a new lens to appreciate our lives through the life of this character and kind of sharpening some edges, bringing things into focus a little bit, and also kind of intensifying some hues, I think. Really good stuff. I love the little musings in this. And then finally, we have another passage here, if I can find it. Hang on. Oh, yes, here we also have yet another great passage about memory and kind of the unreliability of memory and how things in our mind kind of get shuffled around a little bit, so that what we recall maybe isn't exactly as it was, but it's very subjective. It's kind of the narrator here reflecting on the subjective nature of the past is based entirely around how we remember it. So, is it because we relive our past years not in their continuous sequence day by day, but in a memory focused upon the coolness or sunshine of some morning or afternoon, suffused with the shade of some isolated and enclosed setting, immovable, arrested, lost, remote from all the rest? And thus the changes gradually wrought not only in the world outside, but in our dreams and our evolving character. Changes which have imperceptibly carried us through life from one time to another, wholly different, are eliminated. That if we relive another memory taken from a different year, we find between the two, thanks to lacunae, to vast stretches of oblivion, as it were the gulf of a difference in altitude or the incompatibility of two different qualities of breathed atmosphere and surrounding coloration. Yeah, good stuff. I love that kind of thing. The narrator is, kind of pondering things. He's musing and reflecting about memory there. I love that. That's what keeps me going with these books, even when they otherwise are quite trying. And this book was unfortunately quite trying, much more so I found than the previous two. Although I was still able to get through it because of just how utterly gorgeous the writing is, and also because of the interspersed little musings of which I have read a selection. So, to rate The Guermantes Way by Marcel Proust, I'm gonna give this book an A minus. I think I gave Swan's Way an A minus. I gave Within a Budding Grove an even A. This one with this book is going down to an A minus because it was boring as hell for long stretches. I'm not kidding. Hundreds of pages of just the most tedious dinner parties and inane crap. It was not fun. It was very trying at times. It's a book that it's none too thrilling. So and there's just so much of it. So this one gets an A minus, but I'm still keeping it in the A range because I don't guess that's an objective flaw with the book is that it's boring, but also like I said, the writing is just so succulent, and those musings of the narrators I just really do enjoy. So it kept me going enough. So yeah, the Guermantes Way gets an A minus. Now like I said, I was killing it reading these books up until this one, but this one made me kind of think that I might need a break. I think I might have to take a break from Proust for a little while. My commitment still stands. I am still committed to reading to the end, although I will say my enthusiasm has dimmed just a little bit because dang, this book was it was so trying. It really was. But like I said, I'm still committed for the long haul. But I think I'm gonna have to take a little sabbatical from these books because I don't want to burn myself out. But as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, um, remember to hit that like button. Subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Oh yeah, and have you read The Guermantes Way? Have you read In Search of Lost Time overall? If you have, let me know what you thought, whether you agree or disagree with what I've said here today. And yeah, until next time, peace.